All right, in Chapter 7, we are going to be talking about algebraic expressions and dealing with them, how to simplify them and do a little more advanced stuff when we have our algebraic expressions. We're starting to get a lot more into the algebra portion of pre-algebra, so Chapters 7, 8, and 9 are really going to be critical coming up here in the future. So we're going to start Chapter 7 with one of the properties of math called the distributive property. Now, it's a very critical property when it comes to algebra, and it's used quite frequently, so it's very important to understand this. So a couple of vocabulary terms we have here are equivalent expressions. These are expressions that have the same value or they mean the same thing. And then, of course, we have our distributive property, which I find really difficult to define in words. It's much better to show you the distributive property than to tell you what the distributive property is. But just for the sake of a definition, I like to say that it is the property that states that the product of a sum is equal to the sum of the products. So this has to do with multiplication and addition and multiplication and subtraction together. So just to illustrate the distributive property, I bet you already know it. So if you could take a second here and pause the video and do this problem mentally. Okay, don't write it down. How would you do 53 times 8 in your mind? Okay, I'm guessing that maybe you use the distributive property. A lot of students will use the distributive property when they do mental math because the distributive property breaks multiplication down into easier components. Now, you may or may not have done this, but how many of you thought of 53 times 8 as 50 times 8 plus 3 times 8. Okay, if you did, then you basically did the distributive property, which is you broke this product into a product of a sum. So you're breaking the 53 into 50 plus 3. So this is equivalent to breaking that 53 into 50 plus 3 and then multiplying by 8. So 50 times 8 plus 3 times 8 is equivalent to 50 plus 3 times 8. This is the distributive property. So we're breaking this product into a sum of products. So then we get 400 plus 24, which is 424. Now that's a much easier way to do mentally because you're breaking it down into products that are much easier to find. So we can see that these were equivalent no matter how you do that. So again, I'm going to say that 50 plus 3 times 8 is equal to 50 times 8 plus 3 times 8. Notice that every part of this sum was multiplied by 8. Okay, so every part of the sum is multiplied by 8, and that's what the distributive property states. Pretty cool property, right? So here's the distributive property written with a sum and a difference. So whenever we have A times a sum or something times a sum, A times B plus C, we take A times everything in the sum. Okay, you're going to take A times B and A times C and then find the sum. So you can find the sum first, or you can find the products first and then find the sum. So it kind of lets us have a choice in what order we're going to do the operations actually. So we're kind of fudging on our order of operations here. Likewise, we can do the difference first in the parentheses, or we can find the product first. We can take A times B and then A times C and then find the difference of those products. And that is what the distributive property is. So just to show you that the distributive property works, we can do this both ways. We can do it the traditional way where we learn the order of operations, or we can use the distributive property and multiply first. So we really have a choice here whether we want to add first or if we want to multiply first. So we can add first, which is probably what we're most comfortable doing right now or what we're used to, and you get 5 times 5 times 16, which is 80. Or we can multiply first using the distributive property. Now, the distributive property says we're going to take everything in the sum times that 5. So we have 5 times 12 plus 5 times 4. We're going to take that 5 times everything in the sum. And 5 times 12 is 60. 5 times 4 is 20. 60 plus 20 is 80. So you can see that it doesn't matter which way we do it. This is a true property. This is the distributive property. We will always get the same thing both ways. So let's take a look at a couple more examples of rewriting numerical expressions using the distributive property. Now we're not going to add first because we want to practice the distributive property here. So I can take everything in this sum times 4 first, and then find the sum. So that gives me 6 times 4 plus 3 times 4, which is 24 plus 12, or 36. And then this next one, I can take everything in this difference times 3/4 first, and then find the difference. 3/4 times 9 minus 3/4 times 2, and that gives me 27/4 minus 6/4, which is 21/4, or 5 1/4. Okay, so we can use the distributive property to evaluate expressions if we choose, but you might be thinking, well, that seems like a lot more work. Why can't I just do the addition or the subtraction first and then the multiplication? And I would probably agree with you. With numerical expressions, it really doesn't make a lot of sense sometimes to use the distributive property. When the distributive property really pays off is when we have expressions like this. When we have algebraic expressions where we cannot do the sum or the difference first. We would normally be stuck, but thanks to the distributive property, we can actually simplify these a little bit more and get rid of the parentheses. So the distributive property says I can take everything in this sum times 4 first. So I can take 4 times x, which is 4x, plus 4 times 5, which is 20. So this expression becomes 4x plus 20. And now the parentheses are gone, and we would consider this maybe a little bit simpler version of that expression. These are equivalent expressions. Just now I have gotten rid of the parentheses. So this is a critical skill to know to get rid of parentheses in algebraic expressions. Next one, I can take everything in this difference times 3, and I get 3n minus 3 times 4, which is 3n minus 12, and that's as simplified as I can get that. Next one, I can take 2/3 times everything in this difference. I get 2/3 d minus 2/3 times 3, and that gives me 2/3 d minus 2. And I have eliminated the parentheses using the distributive property. And then I've got one more here. This one kind of highlights some common errors when it comes to the distributive property and multiplication, and then especially with negatives. Be very careful when you've got a negative outside of parentheses and there's subtraction inside the parentheses. You're going to end up with some kind of double negative things going on. So you really have to pay attention to what you're doing here. I can take -7 times everything in this difference, just like I have before, and I get -7 times e minus -7 times 4, which gives me -7e minus -28. Now that's fine, just like that. That's equivalent, but we don't really like this double negative hanging out in here. And remember that subtracting a negative is like addition. So I'm going to simplify this one step further. -7e plus 28. These are equivalent expressions here, but the one on the bottom that I have in the box is a much better way to write that. We like to avoid double negatives. So that's the distributive property. When we have a sum or a difference in parentheses and you're taking that times something, you can actually do the multiplication first and then the sum or the difference. That's the distributive property.